Hey, what's up, all you art geeks out there? Today I'm going to be showing you the second part of this portrait where I get into the abstraction with a bunch of bright red colors. Now, this is actually part of a Patreon tutorial. If you want to check that out, go over to my Patreon account where you can see the first and second part of this video. And while you're watching this, just keep in mind when you see my hands maybe waving in front of the panel, it's just me explaining some things as I go along for my patrons. So if you want to see the full video, get a lot of explanation on this, check it out over there. Now, to explain this process, I'm going to go ahead and start from the beginning. It's going to be kind of tricky to explain because a lot of this happens at a subconscious level. I'm not really thinking about it. It's more of a gut feeling as I'm going along painting. But let's start from the beginning and see what happens. I have some notes written down to help me along the way. Now, the very first part of this process is very much similar to the first layer of this painting where I go into Photoshop and I do some conceptualizing of the colors. Now, as you can see from the little image on the left, there's some red going over the eyes, and I didn't really take a lot of time in this. I just threw some red on it. I wanted to see if that red looked good with the painting, and I liked it, so that's all I did. I didn't overthink it though. I just went into Photoshop, I made a new layer, I made it a color correction layer, and I just brushed over it with a mask to kind of mask out where the red would go, and I wanted it to go over the eyes like usual, like I like to do with a lot of my work. So that's really as far as I take it as far as planning ahead. Now, after that's all done, that's when I start to finally do some painting. You're seeing that I'm starting to get some of that red figured out over the eyes of the initial portrait. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that the initial layer is completely dry. So if I make some mistakes, if I don't like where it's going, I can always erase it. I can always just rub it off with a rag or a paper towel and get it all the way cleaned off with maybe a little bit of linseed oil. Just get a little linseed oil on my paper towel and then clean it off and start from scratch if I don't like the initial beginnings. Usually that doesn't happen, but what's nice is as I'm going, I can erase very easily but leave the first layer behind. Usually it takes about 4 or 5 days to get that first layer to dry, but pretty straightforward, very easy to help keep things going the right direction, make sure I like how the colors look, and have that ability to erase. So the next part I'd like to talk about is why over the eyes? Why do I do this? Well, for one, I think when I do some abstract things with my paintings, I find that going over the eyes removes the identity of the person. It makes it so you can connect with the subject a bit more. You're not bogged down by who it is. Is it a famous person? Am I supposed to know who this is? You don't really care. Once you get rid of those eyes, it becomes sort of a half abstract, half portrait piece. And my hope is that you just like what's happening with the abstract interaction with the subject. And another reason I like to do this is I feel like it creates an interesting story. And it's not a story that's really well defined. I give it a single word title like usual, so you can maybe go one direction with what maybe I was thinking when I created it, but I like to leave it open. I like for you to sort of fill in the blanks any way you want based on that single word title. This one is actually untitled as of yet. I just started working on this one about a week or so ago, and I might do a couple touch-ups to it, so I haven't fully figured out what I want to call it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I should call it. Give me some single word titles in the comments. That'd be great. Now, another reason that I like to do this, that I like to create a lot of abstraction over the eyes and over the upper part of the head, is I feel like it's just unique. I mean, it's simple as that. It creates a unique painting. There are a lot of portrait painters in the world, if you haven't noticed, and some of them look very similar to each other. But for me, I wanted to find a way to stand out from the crowd. I wanted my work to be unique, and I tried not to overlap anybody else's way of abstracting. Now, I'm not the only portrait painter in the world that's doing abstract paintings. It's not like I'm the first person to think of it. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the world that do some version of an abstract portrait, but I feel like I found my own little niche within a niche where I am doing this in a particular way that nobody else is doing, and that's very tricky to find. I've slowly evolved my style to make sure that I'm not really overlapping anybody too much. I'm sure plenty of you could find a handful of artists that you think of when you see my work, which is totally fine. I've heard it all. I've heard all the artists that are out there. But when I look at their work and I look at mine, I always feel like there is something unique about mine. I'm sure I've gotten some inspiration from some of these other artists over the years. There's plenty of artists, maybe 20, 30 artists that I find inspiration from that are in this particular niche that I look at all the time on Instagram. But I try to make sure that I'm doing my own thing, and that's one of the keys to any kind of artwork is to be unique. Try not to copy anybody too much. That's what I always say. Is just try to be unique, be true to yourself, and don't copy anybody else's work. feel free to get some inspiration. Everybody's getting inspiration from everybody else. Whether you notice it or not, you're always getting inspiration if you're looking at somebody else's art, especially if you love their work. Some of that's going to fall into your work, and that's totally fine. Now, one of the other things that I like to really play with when I'm creating these sort of abstract marks over the eyes is I'm trying to create a wider range of saturation. So if you notice on the first layer, it's fairly desaturated. I mean, you can see that there's blues in the dark areas. It gets a little bit redder in the highlights and midtones, but it's not overly saturated. So I like to save that for the second, third, fourth layer to really push saturation. So there's that wide sort of space between the desaturated and the saturated colors. Sometimes I may gradually build it up. Sometimes it may be a very stark shift in the first layer to the second layer. I think this one's somewhere in between. I'm pushing the reds about as far as I can on my palette. I don't think I could go any more saturated than I am. And that was kind of the goal for this painting, to push the reds as far as I can go. I'm using a lot of cadmium red, a little bit of alizarin claret from Michael Harding. Those are my colors. And some other colors, of course, too. Just look at my palette, you'll see me kind of mixing those together. I'm sure I'm forgetting some reasons why I like to paint over the eyes. I think it creates a nice psychological effect. I think it really makes people think a little bit when they look at my work. It's not something that will sit on your wall and just blend into the background of your interior design. I think it creates a good conversation when you have guests over. People will look at it and go, oh, what's this painting about? And then you can have a discussion, because most people, from my experience, find different ways to look at my work. They have different interpretations, and that's what makes it a lot of fun, in my opinion. So now I want to shift from why I paint this way into how I paint this way and what I'm thinking in my mind, which is kind of hard to talk about because some of it is very instinctual. And that's the first point, is using your instinct when you're painting. When I'm creating these paintings, it's a lot of instinct. It's a lot of just understanding how color works, how color composition works, playing within certain rules so that the composition, the overall color composition, the tonal composition, the locations of colors, all of that, the way it's organized, all that comes into play. Some of it is very much trial and error. There are times when I just don't like a brush mark and I'll erase it with some linseed oil on a rag and just rub it away, start over on a certain section. And sometimes you'll just have some great elusive brush marks. And these are the kind of brush marks that are so hard to have happen with each painting. When you get this amazing brush mark that is one of those most elusive of things, when it just looks so beautiful, you don't know how you did it, you couldn't replicate it again if you tried, and you have to see it when it happens. When it happens, you got to know just to leave it alone. Now, of course, sure, you can touch it up a little bit, but when you have a great brush mark, you have to notice it and try to leave it alone. I always try to find those elusive brush marks as I'm going. I try to spot them as they come. There have been plenty of times where I've really been mad at myself when I see them and I realize I should have left it alone. I end up painting over it or doing something to it and it loses that elusiveness, and it drives me crazy when I do that. I wish I could just recognize them every time and know, just leave it alone. It's amazing. But sometimes when I do touch it up, it is actually for the best. It's one of those fun things about artwork. You just never know. You don't know the future of where your work's going to take you. Now, when I'm working on the first layer too, before I jump into the really strong abstraction, I like to make sure I have all my tonal composition figured out as much as possible, so that when I'm painting over it with these really strong colors, I'm not having to think about tonal shifts. I'm really just matching the tone of the layer before. So these reds you're seeing that are going over it, they're more or less in the same sort of rough tonal area of the layers before. So the bright reds, even though they're brighter in saturation, they are not really tonally brighter or darker. It's just sort of matching up with what's already there. And it kind of keeps the tonal balance the same. So if I was to say, take this painting, turn the whole thing to black and white after I'm done, you'd notice that the tones are about the same. And I feel like that's one of the keys, is to keep a balance of your tones, keep a check on those tones, make sure nothing gets too far out of whack, because tonal composition is almost, if not more important than color composition. Another thing that I approach a little bit different from my previous layer is the way I put my brush marks on. I try to go a little bit more expressive with my brush marks. I try to go a little bit more intentional. I try to go with long, big brush strokes that will show up at the very end of the painting. I'm always looking for some different scales with my brush strokes. I'll start with maybe a number 2 and go all the way up to a number 6, 12, maybe even wider for the brush marks depending on the size of the painting, but try to have a variation in brush marks. If you end up using, say, a number 2 or a number 4 for the whole painting, for me, it becomes sort of monotonous. It becomes a little bit boring, in my opinion, if you use the same brush size for an entire painting. Now, there's plenty of artists out there that do this, and they do pull it off really well. But for me, I love to use different brush sizes because that gives me a chance to have these really intentional brush marks of different varying widths throughout the painting process, especially in this abstract portion of the painting. Now, finally, I think when I'm getting towards the end, and I get this question a lot, is how do you know when it's done? How do you know a painting is done? And this is something I probably could never explain if I tried. It's just one of those things. I sit back, I'll take a few steps back from my painting, I'll look at it, and I'll just know. I'll know I'm really close, or I'll know I'm done with certain parts of it. I'll know I'm done with the abstraction. I'll go, yeah, I'm done with the abstraction. Maybe I have to touch up the nose or the mouth, like this painting, for example. After taking a few steps back, giving yourself a little break, taking a little 5-minute break, coming back, and then looking at it, you'll know when it's done. I think for most artists, you get better with this as you go, and it's easy to overwork a painting though. So I try to stop earlier than I would maybe, and then take a 5-minute break, come back, look at it, and I'll know, yes, I got the level of brush marks where I want it. I got the nice variation. I'll kind of go through some check boxes, like, is the tonal composition good? Do I have colors located in the right place? Are the colors working with everything? But what I think you'll find out is you will have a set of rules. You have a set of kind of things you want to check off. There's a little bit of that instinct that just gives you an idea that you're done. And it's really hard to figure that out until you've painted a few hundred paintings to really get that locked in. But you'll get there. You'll understand what you're going for with your style, and you'll know what kind of things you're looking for towards the end. And that's about it for why I paint the way I do as far as the abstraction goes. Now, this painting, it is basically done. I think I'm going to end up touching up the nose and the mouth a little bit in one final pass. So there'll be the kind of like the third pass that might take an hour. So this whole painting is going to end up being about 4 hours total, I think, which is about right for an 11 by 14 inch for me. That's kind of what I shoot for this size. I feel like I get the right amount of detail. The bigger I go and the more time it takes. And for each size up or each size down, I try to adjust what I'm shooting for hours. But there are times when I'll double those hours, I'll triple those hours. I'm really maybe experimenting. I don't really know where I'm going. I'm kind of fumbling around, trying some new things. And I don't mind it when that happens, because usually there's some growth happening in those times where it takes me a bit longer than it normally would. But I love it when a painting ends up getting done quick. Usually those are the ones that go the quickest. Usually the paintings that are the most effortless or seem the most effortless or take the least amount of time are the ones that have the best chance of being sold, just because I think a viewer can tell when a painting's been overworked, even if you're not an art expert. You can just get a feeling, you get a vibe from a painting when there's some really good confidence in the brushstrokes. So all that comes into play. Sales and how to sell your paintings, that's a whole nother subject for another day. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear what you would title this painting. I would suggest, if you want to see this in its full entirety with voiceover from the actual painting process, go over to my Patreon account. You'll get to see this and the previous layer done through my Patreon account, where I'm talking through the whole thing, explaining what I'm thinking. It's just a painting demonstration, not really a tutorial, but there's a little bit of demonstration, a little bit of tutorial happening in both the videos for this one. And I think you'll learn a lot by checking that out over there on Patreon. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I would love to answer any questions you have. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you, all you art geeks, for checking out this little video. I will talk to you again very soon. Bye.